She inherited nothing from her deceased father, except a promissory note and a stepmother who wanted to get rid of her like a piece of trash. In the town square, before dozens of people, Eliza Ashcroft was put up for auction like a commodity. No one spoke. No one dared. Until a man feared throughout the frontier, spurred his horse out of the shadows and placed the final bid. He didn't buy her out of kindness. No one in this land does anything out of kindness. But what he did afterward, no one could have predicted. If you enjoy stories of courage, justice, and humanity in the wilderness, please like and comment the name of the city you're viewing, so I know how far my story has come. Now let's return to the frontier in 1878. The morning her father was buried, Eliza Ashcroft made herself a promise. She would not cry in front of Vivian. She stood at the edge of the grave with her hands folded and her jaw set, watching the men from town lower the pine box into the red clay dirt. The sky above Harlan's Creek was the color of ash, and the wind off the ridge carried the smell of dry grass and coming cold. Autumn was moving in fast this year. Everything felt like it was ending at once. Her father, Thomas Ashcroft, had been a decent man. Not a rich one, not a particularly lucky one, but decent in the way that counts most. He kept his word, he didn't drink past sundown, and he never once raised his hand to her. That mattered more than Eliza could say out loud, because she'd known enough men in Harlan's Creek who couldn't claim any of those things. She was 23 years old. She'd been running the household and half the ranch operation since she was 16 when her mother passed from a fever that swept through the county one bad summer. Thomas had done his best after that, but his best had limits. He remarried 2 years later, bringing Vivian Crow into the house and into their lives with her silk dresses and her sharp smile and her way of looking at things, at people, like she was calculating their worth to the last cent. Eliza had learned quickly. Vivian didn't love Thomas. She'd married him for the land. Now Thomas was in the ground, and the land question was about to become very complicated. Vivian stood on the other side of the grave in a black dress that fit her too well for something thrown together in 3 days. She'd been ready for this. Maybe not the exact moment, but ready in the way that certain kinds of people are always ready, positioned, prepared, with their next move already thought out. She caught Eliza looking and gave her a small, composed smile. Eliza looked away. The will reading happened 4 days after the burial, in the front parlor of the Ashcroft house, with a lawyer named Dobbins, who'd ridden out from Caldwell County. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the uncomfortable posture of someone who delivered bad news for a living. Eliza sat in the straight-back chair by the window. Vivian sat across from her on the settee, hands folded in her lap, looking perfectly patient. Dobbins unfolded the document and cleared his throat. The ranch, the cattle, and all associated property of the Ashcroft homestead, he read, are to be divided equally between Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft and Miss Eliza Ashcroft, with the stipulation that Miss Eliza retains residential rights to the main house for a period of no less than 5 years. That's not the will, Vivian said. Dobbins stopped. I beg your pardon? That's not the will Thomas filed. Vivian's voice was calm, precise. The updated will, the one he signed 3 months ago, supersedes that document. I have a copy here. She produced a folded paper from inside her sleeve like she'd been holding it there all morning, which she probably had. She handed it to Dobbins without looking at Eliza. Dobbins read it over. His ink-stained fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper. This does bear the proper seal, he said slowly. And 2 witnesses. It does, Vivian agreed. Eliza felt something cold move through her. Let me see that. Miss Ashcroft, let me see it. Dobbins passed it to her, and Eliza read it. Read it twice, slowly, her eyes moving over every line like she was searching for a loose board in a rotten floor. The new will left everything. The house, the land, the cattle, every fence post and water right, to Vivian. Eliza's name appeared only once, in a single line that described her as a dependent to be maintained at Vivian's discretion. Her father's signature was at the bottom. It looked right. It looked exactly right, which was what made her stomach drop. Thomas Ashcroft had not been a well man in his final months. There had been weeks when he could barely lift himself out of bed, when his hands shook too badly to hold a fork properly. Vivian had been very attentive during those months, very present. "I'd like to speak to the witnesses," Eliza said. "Of course," Vivian said pleasantly, "though I should mention that one of them has since moved on to Wichita, and the other, well, Mr. Pruitt is elderly. His memory isn't what it was." Eliza set the document down on her knee. She kept her hands very still. "This is forged," she said. The room went quiet in a specific way, the way rooms go quiet when something true and dangerous has been said out loud. Vivian tilted her head slightly. "Be careful, Eliza. My father would not have cut me out of this land. He built it for both of us. I know his handwriting, and I know what he wanted." "What you know," Vivian said, her voice dropping just a degree, "and what you can prove are two very different things. And right now, you're a 23-year-old girl with no husband, no money, and no legal standing in this county." She glanced at Dobbins. "Is that about right?" Dobbins had the decency to look uncomfortable. "The document does appear to be in order," he said carefully. "If Miss Ashcroft wishes to contest the will, she would need to pursue the matter through the territorial court in Caldwell, which would take months," Vivian said, "and cost money she doesn't have." She looked back at Eliza with something that might have been pity, except her eyes were completely empty of it. "I'm not an unreasonable woman. I'll give you 2 weeks to make arrangements." "Arrangements," Eliza repeated. "To find somewhere to go." She found something to do with herself those 2 weeks. She searched the house, methodically, quietly, starting with her father's study the night after the will reading while Vivian was asleep. Thomas had been a careful man when it came to paper. He'd kept records of everything: livestock counts, rainfall measurements, the exact dates he'd plowed each field. She found his land journal tucked behind a loose board in the bottom of his desk drawer. It was a battered leather thing, water-stained on the cover, filled with his careful handwriting. She took it to her room and read it by lamplight until 2 in the morning. What she found made her sit very still for a long time. Her father had been tracking irregularities in the county's land records for almost 3 years. Property lines that had shifted, water rights that had been quietly reassigned, neighboring homesteads that had changed hands under circumstances Thomas considered suspicious. He'd noted names: the Holt family, the Sutter spread to the north, the widow Crane's property that had somehow ended up in Garland Purcell's portfolio after she'd left the territory under unclear circumstances. Thomas had been building a picture, slow and careful, of something that went beyond 1 or 2 bad deals. He'd been building a picture of a system. At the bottom of the last entry, dated 6 weeks before his death, he'd written, "Vivian knows more about the Purcell arrangement than she lets on. I should not have married her. I don't know how to fix this." Eliza read that line 4 times. Then she closed the journal and pressed it flat against her chest in the dark, listening to the silence of the house that was no longer hers. She hid the journal inside the lining of her traveling bag. Whatever came next, she wasn't leaving without it. The 2 weeks ended on a Tuesday. Eliza came downstairs that morning with her bag packed and her chin up, expecting... She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Some kind of confrontation, maybe. Vivian at the door with a cold dismissal. She hadn't let herself think much past that, which was a mistake. 2 men she didn't recognize were in the front room. They were the type of men whose purpose was immediately clear from how they stood. Arms loose, no particular expression, taking up space with the practiced stillness of people who were paid to wait. Vivian was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked up when Eliza appeared at the bottom of the stairs. "Good," she said. "You're ready." "Ready for what?" Eliza said. "I packed my things. I was planning to—" "I made an arrangement," Vivian said, "to offset some of your father's debts." She said your father's debts with a specific kind of emphasis, like she was doing Eliza a favor by calling them that. "What kind of arrangement?" Vivian set down her coffee cup. "There's an auction in town this morning. You'll be presented along with several other young women who are in similar situations. Debts, no family, no prospects. Men who need household help or companionship or—" "You're not serious," Eliza said. "I'm very serious." The word auction had landed somewhere in Eliza's chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were still moving outward. She understood what was being said. She understood it clearly, but understanding a thing and accepting it were two completely separate operations, and she was not prepared to accept it. "You can't do this," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "You can't sell a person. Not even on the frontier. There are laws. There are debts," Vivian said. "And there are documents that describe you as a dependent of this estate, which means your labor and your person fall within the estate's resources, legally speaking." She picked up her coffee again. Dobbins was quite helpful in clarifying the specifics. "Dobbins is a coward," Eliza said. "Dobbins is a practical man, as we all should be." Vivian nodded to the two men in the doorway. "She won't cause trouble," she told them. "But don't give her an opportunity to." The auction was held in the square at the center of Harlan's Creek, which was also where they held livestock sales and the occasional public shaming of men who'd cheated at cards. The proximity was not lost on Eliza. There were 6 women in total, standing on a raised wooden platform that had been built sometime that morning. Eliza didn't know most of them. A girl who couldn't have been more than 17 with red-rimmed eyes and bitten nails. A woman in her 30s with the particular stillness of someone who'd already survived worse things. 2 sisters who held each other's hands and stared at the dirt. One woman, older, kept her eyes straight ahead and her face completely blank, and Eliza found herself watching her, trying to learn something from that blankness. The crowd below was mostly men. A few women stood at the edges, watching. Nobody looked comfortable exactly, but nobody was leaving either. Eliza stood near the end of the line with her bag at her feet. They'd let her keep the bag, which meant they hadn't searched it, which meant the journal was still safe inside the lining. She held on to that fact like a hand grip on a steep slope. It was small. It was something. The man running the auction was named Cates. He had a red face and a booming voice, and the air of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work, which was the worst thing about him. He moved down the line calling out attributes. "This one's a hard worker. Look at those hands. This one can cook and sew." And Eliza felt her face go hot, and then cold, and then completely numb as she understood that he was going to do the same to her. She looked out at the crowd. Some of the men watching were familiar. Pete Gilroy from the feed store, who'd always been polite to her. The Hanson brothers from the North Road. 2 men she didn't know, younger, who were whispering to each other and pointing at the women on the platform. In the back, near the dry goods store, she spotted Sheriff Burl Tanner leaning against a post with his thumbs in his belt, watching the proceedings with the detached attention of a man who's decided something is not his problem. She caught his eye deliberately. He looked away. She had grown up in this town. She had bought flour and thread and lamp oil from these people. She had attended the same social events, stood in the same church doorway on Sunday mornings, walked the same 3 blocks of main road her entire life. And not one person in that crowd was going to open their mouth. The realization didn't make her angry, exactly. She'd always known the shape of this town. She just hadn't expected to feel its edges this sharply. Cates reached her. He gripped her arm above the elbow to turn her toward the crowd. She shook him off, which got a murmur from the audience. And then he started his recitation. 23, strong, good health, capable of ranch work and household management, no children, educated enough to keep ledgers. He named a starting price. 3 men raised their hands. One of them was already drunk at 10 in the morning. Eliza kept her eyes level. She thought about the journal in her bag. She thought about her father's handwriting, those careful, cramped letters pressing into the page, and the line he'd written, "I don't know how to fix this." She thought very specifically and clearly that she was going to find a way to fix it herself, and then she was going to make Vivian Crow regret every single choice she'd made. The bidding went up. The drunk man dropped out. 2 left. And then, from the back of the crowd, a horse pushed through. None. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of hooves moving with a particular kind of deliberateness through the packed dirt of the square, the crowd parting the way crowds part for men of a certain reputation. Not scrambling, exactly, but making space. Creating distance without being obvious about it. Rhett Calloway rode a dark bay horse that matched his mood, which was the specific mood of a man who wanted everyone to understand he'd rather be somewhere else. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen better decades, with a hat pulled low enough that you had to look twice to read his face. The face, when you did read it, gave you very little to work with. Hard jaw, dark eyes, a scar along his left cheekbone that he'd never bothered to explain to anyone, because explaining things to people was not something Rhett Calloway did. He was 31 years old. He'd come to Harlan's Creek 3 years ago and set up a ranch in the mountains east of town, and in 3 years he'd had approximately 4 conversations of any length with any resident of the town, which was how he preferred things. People in Harlan's Creek called him dangerous, which was partly true. They called him a killer, which required more qualification. They said he'd ridden with a hard crew down in Texas before he came north, that he'd put men in the ground and not lost a night's sleep over it, that he'd broken a man's arm with his bare hands over a card game in the Silver Spur Saloon the previous winter, and then sat back down and finished his drink. Most of that was accurate. The card game, specifically, was accurate. What they didn't say about Rhett Calloway, because most people in small towns are not in the habit of saying complicated things about their monsters, was that he'd broken that man's arm because the man had been in the process of robbing a Chinese family who ran the laundry on the edge of town. That detail had gotten lost somewhere between the event and the retelling. Details like that usually do. He stopped his horse at the edge of the platform and looked up at the women standing there. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight adjustment, almost imperceptible, like a man who's just seen something that offends his sense of order. "What's the bid?" he said. Cates blinked at him. The 2 remaining bidders looked over. The crowd went quiet in a way that was different from the earlier quiet. This was the quiet of people recalibrating. On which Cates started. "Her." Rhett nodded at Eliza without looking away from Cates. "What's the current bid?" Cates named the number. Rhett named a higher one. Not a little higher, significantly higher. High enough that the 2 remaining bidders exchanged a look and both stepped back because no price point was worth the complication of competing with Rhett Calloway for anything. Cates looked at Vivian Crow, who was standing off to the side. She gave a small nod. "Sold," Cates said, with considerably less enthusiasm than he'd had 30 seconds earlier. Eliza looked at Rhett Calloway. He was already looking at her with those dark eyes that gave nothing away. "You can get down now," he said, "or I can wait, but I'd prefer to be out of this town before noon." "I don't know you," Eliza said. "No," he agreed. "You don't. I'm not going anywhere with a stranger." He tilted his head about 1/4 of an inch. "Your other option is staying here." She picked up her bag. The crowd parted to let them through, and nobody said a word, and Sheriff Tanner watched them go with the carefully maintained expression of a man who'd seen nothing. They rode out of Harlan's Creek on the North Road without speaking for almost an hour. Eliza rode a borrowed horse from the livery that Rhett had arranged with a single sentence and too much money. She didn't know how much. She'd been standing 6 feet away trying to recalibrate everything about what was happening. The horse was a brown mare with a twitchy left ear and an uncertain gait that forced Eliza to pay attention, which was almost a relief, something concrete to focus on. Rhett rode ahead of her by about half a length, and she studied the back of him the way she'd study any problem she didn't yet understand. The set of his shoulders, the way he held the reins. He wasn't watching her, but she got the sense he was aware of exactly where she was and what she was doing, the way experienced ranch hands are aware of everything in their peripheral vision without seeming to look. Finally, she said, "I'd like to understand what just happened." He didn't answer immediately. A hawk crossed the road above them and dropped into the grass to the left. He watched it. "Pretty clear what happened," he said. "Not the part I need explained." She kept her voice even. "The part where a man who doesn't involve himself in other people's business rode into the middle of a public auction and spent what I'm guessing was a significant amount of money on a woman he's never met. That's the part I'm less clear on." "I had the money." "That's not an answer." He glanced back at her over his shoulder, just a glance. "You're right," he said. "It isn't." She waited. He turned back to the road. Another long stretch of silence, pine trees beginning to close in on both sides as the road angled up toward the mountain ridge. The air smelled cleaner up here, cooler, with that resinous bite that Eliza associated with elevation. "I knew your father," he said finally. "Not well. We'd spoken a handful of times over the past year. He mentioned you. He paused. Said you were the one keeping the ranch running. He was sick, she said. There was no defensiveness in it. It was just the fact. I know. Another pause. Last time I saw him was maybe 2 months back. He seemed unsettled. Said there were things he couldn't make right. He didn't go into detail and I didn't push. That's not my way. He stopped talking for a moment, and when he started again, his voice was slightly different, more careful. When I came into town this morning and saw what was happening, I made a decision. What kind of decision? The quick kind. He reached up to adjust his hat without looking back at her. I've got land, extra room. You need somewhere that isn't under Vivian Crow's roof. He said Vivian's name the way people say names they've heard mentioned in bad contexts. That's the situation. Nothing beyond that. Eliza absorbed this. She watched the road ahead of them, the way it curved up and around a rocky outcrop before disappearing into the trees. And what do you expect in return? She asked. She kept her voice neutral, but the question wasn't neutral, and they both knew it. Work, if you want to give it, he said. I run cattle, mostly. The ranch could use another pair of capable hands, but that's an offer, not a condition. He glanced back at her again. There are no conditions. She believed him, which surprised her. She wasn't sure why she believed him. She wasn't a particularly trusting person by nature, and had even less reason to be trusting today, of all days. But there was something in the way he said it. No conditions. Not the tone of a man trying to convince her. The tone of a man stating a fact. Vivian is going to come after me, she said. People generally come after things they think belong to them. A beat. You don't belong to Vivian Crow. She'll say I do. She'll have paperwork saying I do. Let her have paperwork. Something shifted in his voice. Not quite anger. Closer to contempt, but aimed outward, away from her. I'm not afraid of Vivian Crow. You should be a little afraid of her, Eliza said. She's smarter than people give her credit for, and she doesn't operate alone. She's connected to men with real money and real influence in this county. He didn't say anything to that. I have evidence, Eliza said. She said it carefully, watching the back of his head for a reaction. My father kept records, detailed records going back 3 years. Land fraud, water rights manipulation, properties that changed hands under circumstances that don't hold up to scrutiny. He had names, dates, amounts. Now Rhett Calloway turned in the saddle and looked at her properly for the first time. His dark eyes moved over her face with a kind of focused attention that she hadn't expected. Not aggressive, just assessing, the way a man looks at a situation he's trying to correctly understand. You have these records, he said. I have them. On you. Yes. He looked at her for another 2 seconds, then turned back to the road. She thought she heard something from him. Not quite a sigh. Something that might have been a quieter version of course you do. That changes things, he said. I know. If the people named in those records find out you have them, I know that too, Eliza said. I've been aware of it since I found them. She shifted her grip on the reins. I wasn't planning to let that stop me. The road curved up steeply now, and the wind off the ridge hit them both at once, cold and sharp. Eliza's hair came loose on one side. She tucked it back without breaking stride. She thought she saw the corner of Rhett Calloway's mouth move. Not quite a smile. She doubted the man had a full smile in him. But something. How far to your ranch? She said. 3 more hours, give or take. All right, she said. Then we have time. Tell me everything you know about Garland Purcell. He was quiet for a moment. Purcell, he said, and the name came out like he was testing the weight of a stone before throwing it. What do you know about him? He's mentioned in my father's journal 4 separate times. He's connected to the auction system, the one Vivian used today, and I think he's behind most of the land seizures my father was tracking. She paused. I think Vivian works for him, not the other way around. Rhett didn't answer for a long moment. The trees were thick around them now, the trail narrowing, the sky a pale stripe above the canopy. I've had run-ins with Purcell's men, he said. Not with Purcell directly. He doesn't show up directly for anything. Another pause. He owns the bank in Caldwell County. He's on 3 different land committees. He's got the sheriff in his pocket, and probably 2 or 3 judges. So he's protected. From most things. But not from documented evidence presented before a territorial court, Eliza said. Rhett made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't disagreement either. Assuming you can get it that far. That's the part that requires some planning, she said, and possibly your help, if you're willing to give it. He rode without answering for about 30 seconds, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. I didn't say I wanted to get involved in a legal fight, he said. You got involved when you rode into that square this morning, she said. Not unkindly, just factually. He seemed to sit with that for a moment. Yeah, he said finally. I suppose I did. The Calloway Ranch sat on a flat shelf of land about 2/3 of the way up the eastern ridge, sheltered on 3 sides by pine-covered slopes and open on the south face to a long view of the valley below. In the last light of the afternoon, it looked, Eliza searched for the right word, it looked held somehow, like the mountain was keeping it. The main structure was a log house that had been added to in stages, each addition slightly less careful than the last, the way buildings look when they've been expanded by a man working alone with whatever time he had. There was a barn in reasonable condition, a chicken coop, a long, low building that might have been a bunkhouse at some point, and a corral where 6 horses moved in the cold late light. The whole place had the particular look of a working ranch run without enough hands. Everything functional, nothing decorative, no concession to appearance beyond what necessity required. Rhett dismounted and led both horses to the corral without ceremony. He was a different kind of quiet up here than he'd been on the road. Less guarded, she thought. More settled. This was clearly the only place he was actually comfortable. He handed her a lantern from just inside the barn door and led her through the house without much explanation. The main room with a fireplace and a table, a small kitchen, a back corridor with 2 rooms off it. He opened the door to the second room and stepped back. It was plain. A bed with a wool blanket, a small chest of drawers, a window that looked out at the slope. It's not much, he said. It's fine, Eliza said, and she meant it. She crossed to the chest of drawers and laid her bag on top of it and stood with her hands flat on the leather surface. There's food in the kitchen, he said. Help yourself. He started to turn away. Calloway, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said. What you did today, I know what it cost you, not just the money. She paused. You came off the mountain. You got in the middle of something. That's not nothing, from what I understand about you. He was quiet for a moment, with his back still half turned. Don't put too much on it, he said. I just didn't like what I was seeing. Still, she said. He gave a short nod, the kind of nod that's really just acknowledgement that a thing has been said, and left her alone in the room. Eliza sat on the edge of the bed. The wool blanket smelled like cedar and cold air. Outside, the wind was picking up off the ridge, coming down through the pines, and she could hear it moving around the corners of the house with a low, even sound. She reached into the lining of her bag and pulled out her father's journal. She held it in both hands in the dim light from the lantern, feeling the battered leather under her fingers. Thomas Ashcroft had carried this for 3 years. He'd seen what was happening to the people around him, and he'd written it all down, careful line by careful line, because he hadn't known what else to do. I don't know how to fix this, he'd written. I do, she said quietly to the empty room. I think I do. She opened the journal to the first page and began to read from the beginning, making notes of her own on the blank pages at the back. Tomorrow she'd need to understand everything, every name, every date, every property. If they were going to build a case strong enough to bring before a territorial judge, strong enough to survive whatever Purcell and Vivian threw at them, then she needed to know this material the way she knew the layout of her father's ranch. Better, maybe. Outside, she heard Rhett Calloway moving through the kitchen, the scrape of a pot on the stove, the solid, ordinary sounds of a man going about his evening in the only place he felt like himself. She kept reading. The wind came down through the trees, and the lantern flame bent and steadied, and somewhere in the valley below, Harlan's Creek settled into its nighttime quiet, not knowing yet, not even guessing, what was coming for it. She was still awake at 3 in the morning when the lamp burned low enough to make the words blur. Eliza set the journal down and pressed her fingers against her eyes, and for a moment she let herself sit in the dark and just breathe. 3 hours of reading her father's careful handwriting had left her with a headache behind her right eye and something heavier than a headache sitting in the center of her chest. Thomas Ashcroft had known more than she'd realized. He'd known for longer, too. And he'd been afraid, not of any single person, but of the scale of what he was seeing, of how many people were involved, and how far their reach extended into the ordinary machinery of the county. She found the entry she'd been searching for near the middle of the journal, dated almost 2 years back. Purcell's man came to the property today. Didn't give a name. Said it was a courtesy visit, wanted to know if I'd considered the offer on the north pasture. I told him I hadn't made any offer available. He smiled and said sometimes offers arrive before people know they need them. I told him to get off my land. He left without argument. That's the part that bothers me most. He left without argument. Eliza read it twice. Then she turned to the back pages where she'd been making her own notes and wrote, Purcell approached Thomas directly. Land acquisition attempt, north pasture, approximately 22 months ago. Thomas refused. Timeline. Did the forgery happen before or after this visit? She'd figure that out in the morning. Right now her eyes wouldn't focus properly, and the wind was still working at the corners of the house, and she needed at least a few hours of sleep if she was going to be useful. She put the journal under the mattress, which wasn't a sophisticated hiding place, but it was better than leaving it on the chest of drawers, and she lay down on top of the blanket with her boots still on. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Rhett was already up when she came into the kitchen at first light. He was standing at the stove with a coffee pot and 2 cups on the table, which she took as either hospitality or habit. She wasn't sure which and didn't ask. Sleep? He said. Some. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup he'd already filled. The coffee was strong to the point of being confrontational, which was exactly what she needed. I finished going through my father's journal last night. He turned from the stove. He had an expression on his face that he probably thought was neutral, but was actually closer to cautious. And? It's worse than I thought. She set down the cup. Purcell has been running systematic land acquisition across at least 3 counties that my father could document. He uses a combination of forged deeds, manufactured debt claims, and what I think are coordinated harassment campaigns. Things like water diversions, fence cutting, that kind of slow pressure, to force smaller ranchers to sell at losses. Then the properties get absorbed into shell arrangements that tie back to his banking interests in Caldwell. She paused. And the auction system, the one Vivian used on me, that's part of it too. It's a way of handling people who can't be otherwise removed from a property, dependents, heirs, anyone whose presence complicates the transfer of land. Rhett pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was the first time she'd seen him sit at the table. He'd eaten standing up the night before, leaning against the counter like sitting down was something he only did under specific circumstances. How many properties, he said, that my father documented specifically? 11. But he wrote in the last entry that he thought there were more he hadn't been able to trace. She looked at him directly. How long have you had this ranch? He didn't seem surprised by the question. 3 years. Did anyone approach you about selling in that time? Something moved across his face. Once, he said, about 8 months ago. Man I didn't know said he represented an investment group in Caldwell County. Very polite, very reasonable price offered. What did you say? Told him no. Did he come back? No, Rhett said. Then, after a pause, but I had trouble with a section of my north fence line about 6 weeks later. Cut clean, not broken. 3 steers wandered 2 miles before I found them. He looked at the table for a moment. I figured it was someone passing through, didn't put it together. Eliza felt the pieces connecting. They assessed you, she said, decided you'd be too much trouble and moved on to easier targets. She thought of her father alone in that study, writing in his journal with shaking hands. My father wasn't an easy target either, but Vivian was already inside the house. That's different. She stopped herself. That's worse, Rhett said quietly. Yes. They were both quiet for a moment. Outside, the early light was coming through the south window at a low angle, catching the dust suspended in the air above the table. I need to get this to a territorial judge, Eliza said. Not Sheriff Tanner, not anyone in this county. Tanner is either on Purcell's payroll or scared enough to behave like he is. What I have in that journal would need to go to someone with actual jurisdiction and no local ties. She looked at him. Do you know anyone like that? There's a man named Aldridge, Rhett said slowly. Federal judge, circulates through the territory 4 times a year. He's based out of Denison, about 80 miles northeast. Honest, from what I've heard, meaning nobody's been able to buy him, which is rarer than it should be. He crossed his arms on the table. But getting there is a problem. How so? Because the moment Vivian figures out you have those records, said, and she will figure it out probably within a day or two, Purcell's people will be looking for you, and the road to Denison goes through Caldwell County, which is Purcell's territory. Then we go around Caldwell. Around adds 3 days? Through the Ridge Country, which isn't a road so much as a suggestion. He looked at her steadily. It's also November. The high passes will be rough. I'm aware of what November is, she said. There was no sharpness in it, just a fact. She'd been riding rough terrain in November since she was 12 years old. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening, exactly. More like a small recalibration. All right, he said. But we need to make copies of the most critical records before we go anywhere. If something happens to the original journal, I already thought of that, she said. I need paper and ink. He got up and found both without being asked, which was the first moment she thought they might actually be able to work together. They spent the rest of that morning and most of the afternoon copying. Eliza wrote in a fast, clear hand, the same hand she'd used for her father's ledgers, and Rhett sat across from her and went through the original journal page by page, calling out the entries she needed to prioritize. It was methodical, unglamorous work, and they did it mostly in silence, broken by occasional short exchanges. This name here, Sutter, Rhett said, midway through the afternoon. Robert Sutter. His place was about 12 miles north of town. He left the territory about 18 months ago, said it was family business back east. Nobody questioned it much. My father's notes say Sutter was approached 3 times before he left, Eliza said, without looking up from the page she was copying. The 3rd time, 2 of his horses went missing overnight and a section of his barn burned, officially ruled accidental. The sheriff's report is in here. Tanner's deputy filed it, said a lantern was left burning. She paused. The lantern was described as being in a storage section where Sutter kept no lanterns. My father noted that discrepancy. Rhett was quiet for a moment. Thomas was thorough, he said. He was scared, Eliza said. Scared people are thorough. They notice things. She dipped the pen and kept writing. He just didn't know what to do with what he'd noticed. Do you? She looked up at that. He was watching her with those dark eyes that she'd spent the last 18 hours trying to read with limited success. I know what the first step is, she said. Get this to Aldridge. After that, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know exactly what a territorial judge can or can't do, or how quickly. She set the pen down for a second. But I know that what's in this journal is real. I know that 11 families lost land they shouldn't have lost. And I know that Vivian Crow put me on an auction block this morning. She picked the pen back up. That's enough to start. He didn't say anything to that, but he turned to the next page in the journal and kept reading it to her, and she kept writing, and outside the wind moved through the pines on the ridge in long, slow waves. The news came on the 3rd day. A rider appeared on the lower trail at mid-morning, a young man Eliza didn't know, moving fast and looking uncomfortable about it. Rhett went out to meet him while Eliza watched from the kitchen window, one hand resting on the counter. The conversation was short. The rider left quickly, without dismounting. Rhett came back inside and stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his hat in his hand and an expression that told her whatever he was about to say, he'd already decided to say it plainly. Tanner issued a warrant this morning, he said. For me. She set down the cup she'd been holding. On what charge? Theft, specifically theft of a contracted indentured worker. He said the words flatly, like they tasted bad. Meaning you. That's not a legal category, she said. It doesn't have to be legal to get a warrant issued. It just has to get past Tanner, which isn't a high bar. He moved into the kitchen and dropped into the chair. Purcell's men have been asking around town about which direction we rode out. Somebody talked. Probably whoever at the livery rented you that mare. A short pause. They'll know we came north. How long do you think we have before they come up here? Day, he said. Maybe 2. Depends on how motivated Purcell is to move quickly. He looked at her. He'll be motivated. She'd known this was coming. She'd known it since she'd taken the journal from her father's desk and hidden it in her bag, and she'd made her peace with it in the abstract. The concrete version was less comfortable to sit with. The image of armed men on the lower trail, moving toward this ridge, toward this house where she'd spent 3 days building something that felt tentatively like a plan. We can't wait, she said. No? Then we leave tomorrow morning, early, before light, if we can manage it. He looked at her for a moment. The ridge route is hard going, he said. I meant that. It's not comfortable travel. I'm not looking for comfort, Eliza said. I'm looking for Aldridge. He nodded once. Not agreement with a plan so much as acknowledgement that the plan was the plan, and there was nothing left to discuss about it. Get some sleep, he said, and pushed back from the table. Calloway, she said. He stopped in the doorway again. She seemed to stop him in doorways a lot, she'd noticed. They're going to come after you even if I'm gone, she said. You understand that. The warrant is for you. Even if I disappeared tomorrow, took the journal and went my own way, you're still the one Tanner has paper on. I know that, he said. So you're in this regardless. I was in it when I rode into that square, he said. I told you. He settled the hat back on his head. Get some sleep. She did. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, sitting in that kitchen on the mountain as the light went out of the afternoon, was what was happening in Harlan's Creek below them. Vivian Crow was not a woman who let problems resolve themselves. She identified problems, she quantified them, and she dealt with them through the most direct mechanism available, which in this particular county meant a man named Cal Decker. Decker ran a small outfit that Purcell funded, and Tanner officially knew nothing about. 4 men, sometimes 5, who handled situations that couldn't be handled through legal channels. He was not creative, he was not subtle. He was effective in the specific way that a hammer is effective, which was why Purcell kept him around. Vivian met him at the edge of the Ashcroft property, her property now, she reminded herself, as the sun was going down. The girl has her father's records, she said, without preamble. We need to assume that. Decker crossed his arms. He was a large man with a face like a county road, rough, unremarkable, built for function over anything else. How much trouble is that? Enough. She looked out at the dark yard. Calloway's ranch is north, up on the eastern ridge. They'll have to come down through Caldwell to get anywhere useful with those records. When they do, she paused. I want the journal. I want the copies, if she's made any. I don't particularly care about the rest. Decker understood what that meant. He'd understood things like that for a long time. And Calloway, he said. Vivian considered it for a moment with the cool, unhurried patience of someone running a calculation. Calloway is a wanted man, she said. Tanner's warrant covers whatever becomes necessary. She went back inside, and Decker went back to his men, and Harlan's Creek settled into darkness. While on the ridge above, Eliza Ashcroft slept with her father's journal pressed beneath her mattress, and a head full of names, dates, and the slowly hardening shape of a plan she wasn't entirely sure she could pull off. The mountain held the ranch in its cold arms. Below, in the valley, the wheels that Vivian had set in motion were already turning. They left before dawn. Rhett had the horses ready by 4 a.m, both saddled, the saddlebags packed with enough food for 4 days and a bedroll each, nothing extra. Eliza came out of the house with her bag over one shoulder and the copied documents wrapped in oilskin tucked inside her coat against her ribs. The originals were in the journal, which rode in the saddlebag closest to her right hand. She'd decided to split them. If something happened to one, maybe the other survived. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one she had. The cold hit her the moment she stepped outside. A hard, flat cold that came down off the ridge without any wind behind it, just pressing down on everything like a hand. Her breath fogged immediately. The horses moved and stamped, and their breath fogged too, and for a moment the yard was full of small white clouds in the darkness. Rhett handed her the mare's reins without speaking. She mounted. He checked the cinch on his own horse with the automatic thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way what a loose cinch cost you, then swung up. They rode out of the yard and into the trees before the first gray light even touched the eastern sky. The ridge route was exactly as difficult as he'd described, and slightly worse than she'd prepared herself for. The trail, calling it a trail was generous, wound through country that was steep in a particular exhausting way, not vertical but relentlessly angled, the kind of terrain that made your legs burn even on horseback from constantly bracing against the grade. Rocks jutted through the frozen ground at irregular intervals. The trees were dense enough in places that branches caught at her shoulders and hair, and she had to duck and turn and thread through gaps that a larger person would have had real trouble with. Rhett picked the path without consulting her and without hesitating, which meant he'd ridden it before, probably more than once. She was grateful for that, even if she didn't say so. They didn't talk much for the first 3 hours. There wasn't much to say, and the terrain required attention. But somewhere around mid-morning, when they stopped to let the horses drink from a thin stream that cut across the trail, he said, "How are you doing?" She looked at him over the back of the mare. "I'm fine. You've been quiet. So have you." "I'm always quiet," he said. "You're quiet differently." She considered that for a moment. The stream was barely moving, the surface skimmed with a thin shelf of ice at the edges that the horses broke through without noticing. "I keep thinking about the other women," she said. "From the auction." He didn't say anything. "I got out because you were there," she said. "The girl with the bitten nails. She didn't get out. The sisters." She stopped. "I don't know where they went. I don't know who bought them or what for. And I'm riding north trying to save my father's land records, and I can't stop thinking that saving the land records doesn't help them." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the stream or past it. She couldn't tell. "If we get those records to Aldridge," he said finally, "and if he acts on them, the auction system gets dismantled. Purcell loses the mechanism and the protection." He paused. "That's not nothing." "It's not immediate," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She let the mare drink a little longer. "I know," she said. "I know it's the best we can do right now. I just—" She stopped again. There wasn't a way to finish the sentence that didn't sound either self-pitying or naive, and she was neither, so she left it incomplete. Rhett pulled his horse back from the water. "When this is over," he said, with a carefulness that told her he'd thought about how to say it, "there'll be room to push for more. If the network is exposed, it can be prosecuted properly. All of it, not just the land." She looked at him. "You say when, like you're certain." "I'm not certain of anything," he said, "but if would just make me miserable all day, and we've got a lot of riding left." She almost laughed. It surprised her, not the almost laugh itself, but that he was capable of producing one. They rode on. Red Bluff Pass opened up in the early afternoon, a narrow corridor between two high rock formations that squeezed the trail down to a width that made her immediately uncomfortable. The bluffs rose maybe 60 feet on either side, reddish sandstone streaked with dark water stains, the tops ragged and broken where frost had worked at the edges over long seasons. The trail through the center was maybe 12 feet wide at its narrowest, with a steep drop on the eastern side that fell away into a scrubby ravine 40 feet below. She didn't like it the moment she saw it. "Is there another way through?" she asked. "Not without adding 2 more days," Rhett said. He was studying the bluffs with a focused expression she recognized by now as his problem-assessing look. "We'll be through in 20 minutes if we move." She was looking at the tops of the formations on either side. The stone up there was broken and irregular. Good cover. Too much cover for something that was already a natural bottleneck. "Rhett," she said. He heard it in her voice. He stopped his horse and looked where she was looking. For a moment, nothing moved. Just wind through the rocks, the distant creak of a pine somewhere above them, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary November afternoon in the high country. Then a horse stamped, 50 feet up on the western bluff, and the sound came down sharp and clear in the cold air. They both heard it. Back, Rhett said, low and immediate, already turning his horse. Back into the trees. They moved fast, not panicked, because panicked movement makes noise, but fast and deliberate, pressing back into the tree line they'd come through, getting the trunks between themselves and the open pass. Eliza's heart was hitting hard against her ribs, steady and loud, and she focused on keeping the mare quiet and keeping her own breathing even. Rhett pulled up beside her in a gap between two large pines. He had his rifle out already. She hadn't even seen him draw it. He was scanning the bluff tops. "How many?" she whispered. "Can't tell yet." He watched for another 10 seconds. "At least 2 on the western side. They had the high ground before we got here. They knew the route." Had to. His jaw was tight. Someone who knows this territory told them about the ridge route, or they had time to scout it themselves. He glanced at her. Either way, they were set up before we arrived. This wasn't improvised. She thought about the rider on the trail 3 days ago, the young man who'd come up to report the warrant. She thought about how quickly information moved in small communities, and how many people in Harlan's Creek might know Rhett Calloway's preferred routes across the ridge. "How many men does Decker run?" she said. 4 typically, sometimes more if Purcell's paying for a specific job. He looked at the bluff top again. This looks like a specific job. The pass in front of them was quiet. Too quiet now, in the specific way that places go quiet when people are in them trying to hold still. "If we go back the way we came, we run into whoever's covering the approach," she said, working through it. "If we go through the pass, we're funneled right under them." "Yeah. So we need them to come down." He looked at her. "Or we need to change the geography." She looked at the bluff tops, and then at the slope directly above the western formation, where the ridge line rose another 100 feet before leveling off. The rock up there was looser. She could see even from here that the frost had done significant work on the upper face. Long vertical cracks, slabs that had shifted and resettled over years of freezing and thawing. Below the loose section, the western bluff formed a natural funnel directly into the pass. She understood what the changed geography might look like. "If something came down from the upper slope," she said slowly, "onto the top of that western formation, it would push whatever was up there down into the pass," Rhett said. He was already seeing it. "Separate the pass from the high ground. And give us a gap to move through on the eastern side. Assuming we time it right." "Assuming that," she agreed. He looked at her steadily. "That's a significant rock slide you're describing. We'd need to get above the formation without being seen, and we'd need a way to trigger the upper face." "The upper face is already unstable," she said. "I could see it from here. The frost has it cracked along the grain. It wouldn't take much. A concentrated impact point near the primary fracture." She stopped because she was talking like an engineer, and this was not an engineering problem. This was a live situation with armed men on a cliff and a 40-foot drop to one side. "Can you get to the upper ridge without coming into their line of sight?" "There's a deer path that angles up through the east side," he said slowly. "Goes around behind the eastern formation and comes out above the western one. I've used it before." He was quiet for a moment. "It'd take 20 minutes to get up there. Maybe 15 if I moved fast. And I hold here." He didn't like that. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "If they figure out where we are," he started. "Then I move and make noise and keep their attention on the tree line," she said. "I grew up on this kind of country. I know how to move without being seen." She looked at him directly. "You're a better shot from the ridge than I am. That's not an argument, it's just accurate." It was accurate, and they both knew it. He'd demonstrated that the previous day when he'd picked off a rabbit at 70 yards without seeming to particularly try. She was competent with a rifle. She was not Rhett Calloway with a rifle. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the revolver he kept as a backup. An older piece, reliable looking, with the comfortable weight of something well maintained. He handed it to her. "Don't do anything unnecessary," he said. "Define unnecessary." His expression was not quite a look of exasperation, but it was close. "You know what I mean." "I'll be careful," she said. He gave her one more look, the kind of look that contained about 6 things he wasn't going to say. and then he was gone, angling the horse away through the trees at a careful, quiet walk. She was alone. The next 15 minutes were the longest of her life. She moved the mare back further into the trees and tied her loosely to a branch, loose enough that the horse could free herself if something went badly wrong, which was a thought Eliza tried not to follow to its conclusion. Then she worked her way through the undergrowth on foot, angling toward the eastern edge of the tree line where she could see the pass entrance and the base of the bluffs without being easily visible from above. She heard them before she saw them. 2 men had come partway down the western bluff, not all the way, just enough to get a better angle on the tree line. They were talking to each other in low voices, not whispering, but not projecting either. She caught fragments. Not there yet. Could have turned back. Decker said, "Wait, Decker." So this was Decker's crew. She counted what she could see. 2 on the western bluff face, partially descended, at least 1 more on the top from the movement she could make out against the sky. The eastern bluff was harder to read. She couldn't get a clear angle on it without moving further out of the tree line than she wanted to. She checked the revolver. Loaded. Good condition, like she'd thought. She settled into a low crouch behind a pine trunk that was wide enough to cover most of her and waited. Above her, somewhere on the upper ridge, Rhett was moving. She couldn't hear him, which was either good tradecraft or he'd encountered a problem. She was going to assume good tradecraft. One of the men on the bluff face raised his voice slightly. "Someone check the north end. They might have circled." A shuffling movement from above, the man on the bluff top moving toward the north edge to look, which meant his back was about to be toward the upper slope. She looked up at the ridge line. Rhett was there. She could barely see him, just a shape against the pale sky, positioned at the top of the loose face above the western formation. He was looking down at her. She held up one hand. Wait. She needed the men on the bluff face to be further down, away from the slide path, or the timing would be wrong. She needed them spread out, not clustered. One of them was moving, descending another 10 feet on the face, trying to see around the angle of the tree line, getting frustrated with the weight. The second man stayed higher. She made a decision. She picked up a loose rock from the ground near her foot and threw it hard to the left, into the deep brush 30 feet away. It hit with a crash that was loud in the quiet afternoon, the sound of something large moving through undergrowth. Both men on the bluff face snapped their heads toward it. She looked up and dropped her hand. She heard it a second later, not a single crack but a series of them, rapid, like something large and old finally letting go of a grip it had been maintaining for years. Then the sound escalated into something that bypassed sound and became something you felt in your sternum, a grinding, rolling percussion that built on itself as the upper face of the ridge gave way and came down. It hit the western bluff formation like a hammer. The man on top had no warning and no time. She heard him shout, a single sharp sound, and then the slide took the top of the formation and poured it into the pass in a cascade of red stone and dust that rose 30 feet into the air. The 2 men on the bluff face scrambled, both going in different directions. The one who descended further lost his footing and went down hard, sliding and catching himself on an outcrop about 15 feet from the ground. The other one made it back up and over the bluff top and disappeared from her sight. The pass was buried under 3 feet of rubble for a span of about 40 yards. The dust hadn't settled when she heard Rhett on the ridge above, moving fast, his horse pushing through the brush on the upper path. He came down the eastern side at a pace that was on the wrong side of careful and emerged onto the trail just south of where the slide had come down. She was already moving to meet him, pulling the mare by the reins, covering the ground between the trees and the trail at a run that she hadn't planned and that her body managed anyway on pure urgency. "East side," he said, pulling up beside her. "1 man, maybe 2. They weren't on the bluff. They were on the trail behind us." "How far back?" "Close enough." He reached down and took her arm, and she put her foot in the stirrup he'd vacated for half a second and swung up onto the mare with a motion that was not graceful and didn't need to be. "Move." She moved. They went through the eastern edge of the pass at a gallop. There was room there, barely, a gap between the slide debris and the eastern bluff face, 6 feet wide and treacherous with loose stone underfoot. The mare hit it wrong with her left forefoot and stumbled, and Eliza's stomach dropped entirely before the horse caught herself and came through, and then they were out the other side and onto the open descending trail that ran north toward the lower country. Behind them, from inside the pass, she heard shouting. Decker's men trying to reorganize, trying to understand what had just happened to their carefully arranged trap. She didn't look back. She leaned low over the mare's neck and rode. They put 6 miles between themselves and Red Bluff before Rhett pulled up on a flat section of trail where he could see the approach behind them for a long distance. He sat his horse and watched the back trail for a full 2 minutes. Nothing moved on it. Eliza pulled up beside him. Her hands were shaking slightly, she noticed. Not a lot, just a fine tremor that she'd be able to stop in a few minutes once the immediate chemical flood of what they'd just been through receded far enough. She'd been shaking for the last mile and hadn't let herself look at it until now. "Clear," Rhett said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. He turned and looked at her. His coat was covered in rock dust from the upper ridge, and there was a cut along his right forearm where a slab had caught him on the way down. She hadn't noticed it until now, the way the dark fabric made the blood invisible until you looked at the right angle. "You're hurt," she said. He looked at the arm like he'd forgotten it existed. "It's not deep. It needs to be cleaned." When we stopped tonight, he was still scanning the trail behind them with a regularity that told her the all clear was professional habit, not actual certainty. "You threw that rock." "Yes." "To split their attention." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Good thinking," he said, which, from Rhett Calloway, she was beginning to understand was approximately equivalent to a lengthy compliment from anyone else. "Good shooting," she said, "or whatever you call triggering a rock slide." "I mostly just pushed on the right crack and got out of the way fast," he said. He looked at his arm again and seemed to decide it was still not a current priority. "We've got maybe 4 hours of light. If we push, we can make the lower country by dark and be out of ridge territory." "Then let's push," she said. She checked automatically that the oilskin package was still pressed against her ribs inside her coat. It was there. Still there. The journal was in the saddlebag, and she could feel its slight weight every time the mare moved, a small, steady presence on her right side. They'd come through the pass. They had the documents. They had a name, Aldridge, and a direction, northeast. And somewhere between here and Denison, 80 miles away, there was a federal judge who hadn't been bought yet. It wasn't enough to feel safe. It wasn't close to enough. Decker's crew would regroup, and Purcell would hear what had happened at Red Bluff within a day. And whatever came next would be calculated and cold, and probably better planned than an ambush on a ridge pass. But they were through, and the documents were intact, and the light ahead of them was still pale and cold and present. Eliza pressed her heels against the mare's sides. They rode north. They reached the lower country by dark, as Rhett had calculated, and found a dry creek bed sheltered on 3 sides by a cut bank that blocked the wind well enough to make a fire possible without it being visible from any significant distance. It wasn't comfort, but it was functional, which was the category of things Eliza had stopped distinguishing from comfort somewhere around mile 4 of the ridge descent. She cleaned the cut on his arm while he sat on a flat rock and held the lantern at an angle that made it easier for her to see. It was deeper than he'd said. Not dangerous, but deep enough that it needed more than a rinse. She used the last of the whiskey from the flask in his saddlebag, which made him pull in a sharp breath through his teeth and then go very still in the deliberate way of a man who has decided not to make any sound at all. "Done," she said, tying off the strip of cloth she'd cut from the hem of her spare shirt. "Thank you," he said. A little stiff, like the words required some effort. "You'd have let it go septic," she said. "Probably not." "You'd have let it go septic," she said again, and he didn't argue. They ate what they had, dried meat and the heel of a loaf of bread that had been fine 3 days ago and was less fine now, and sat by the fire in the particular silence of 2 people who'd nearly died together that afternoon and hadn't yet processed it fully enough to talk about it. The fire popped and shifted. Somewhere in the brush beyond the cut bank, something small moved and was gone. "Aldridge circuits through Denison every 3 months, Rhett said eventually, staring at the fire. "Last circuit was in September, from what I heard. So he should be there now, or close to it." "Should be." A pause. I don't know the man personally. I know his reputation, and I know he handled a land case in Morrow County 2 years back, cited against a railroad acquisition that half the territory thought was settled. That's why people say he's honest. He was willing to cost the railroad money. What happened in Morrow County? Railroad lost the land, appealed twice. Lost both times. He looked at her across the fire. Aldridge doesn't reverse himself under pressure. That's either principle or stubbornness, and in a judge, the distinction doesn't matter much. Eliza turned this over. Purcell will know we're heading for Denison. After the pass, but after Decker reports back, he'll know the ridge route didn't work, and he'll know we're still moving with the documents. Denison is the logical destination. Denison has a federal presence, Rhett said. 2 marshals stationed there permanently. Purcell's reach is long, but going after someone inside a federal judge's jurisdiction in front of witnesses is a different calculation than sending Decker into the ridge country. Different, not impossible. No, he agreed. Not impossible. She was quiet for a moment, turning the problem around. We need someone else to know what's in these documents before we get there. Someone in Denison, or close to it, who isn't connected to Purcell, so that if something happens to us on the last stretch of road, the information doesn't disappear with us. Rhett considered that. There's a woman in the settlement at Blanco Crossing, about 20 miles south of Denison. She runs the post office and the telegraph station both. Name's Margaret Hale. She was married to a man Purcell drove off his land about 4 years ago. Her husband died in the following winter. She has reasons to want Purcell finished. He paused. She'd get a telegraph through to Aldridge's office ahead of our arrival, and she'd know how to keep her mouth shut about where it came from. You know her? We've spoken. She's not someone who forgets a wrong done to her. Eliza looked at him. You know a lot of people for a man who doesn't talk to anyone. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but occupied the same general territory. I talk to people, he said. I just don't do it often or for very long. She let that sit. The fire burned lower. Above the cut bank, the sky was full of stars and the cold, clear air. The kind of sky that existed only at altitude and only in November, too sharp and bright to be entirely comfortable. Get some sleep, he said. I'll take first watch. She didn't argue. She rolled into her blanket and was asleep before the fire burned down another inch. Chatchibok-ichit. Blanco Crossing was a thin scatter of buildings along a creek that had probably been more impressive in a wetter decade. A general store, a livery, a small hotel that also served as the town's only eating establishment, and at the end of the main track, a low wooden building with a hand-lettered sign reading Post and Telegraph. Margaret Hale was a woman in her mid-50s with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had been weathered into permanence. Not hard exactly, but settled, like a rock formation. You got the impression that significant force had shaped it over time and that the shaping was finished. She looked at Rhett when they came through the door, then at Eliza, then back at Rhett. You look worse than usual, she said. Rough few days, he said. I heard there was an incident at Red Bluff Pass. She said it without inflection, moving behind the counter. Word travels faster than horses out here. You'd think people would have more interesting things to discuss. She looked at Eliza properly. You're Thomas Ashcroft's girl. Yes, Eliza said. I knew your father, not well. He came through here once about 2 years back, asking questions about the Hale property transfer. I told him what I knew. She set her hands flat on the counter. I'd been waiting for someone to do something with that information for 2 years. I'd about given up. We need a telegraph to Aldridge's office, Rhett said, ahead of our arrival. We need him to know what we're bringing and from whom, so if we don't arrive... Someone else knows, Margaret said. Yes. She was already pulling out a telegraph pad. Write down what you want sent. I'll put it in language that won't trigger questions if someone else reads it on the line. Eliza wrote it out. Not the details, not the names, but enough. Evidence of systemic land fraud. 3 counties documented, arriving within 48 hours, requesting immediate audience. She added Thomas Ashcroft's name and her own. She looked at it for a moment, then added 11 families, possibly more. She slid it across the counter to Margaret, who read it without expression, then looked up. I'll get this through within the hour, she said. Aldridge's clerk is a young man named Fossey. He's reliable. She paused. Are you eating before you go on? Eliza looked at Rhett. He looked like a man who'd had dried meat and stale bread for 4 days, which he was. Yes, Eliza said. They rode into Denison the following afternoon under a sky that had been building clouds since morning and finally delivered on its promise of weather about 3 miles from town. A cold, thin rain that wasn't quite sleet but was working toward it. Eliza's coat was soaked through before they reached the main street, and the oilskin package inside it was dry and intact, which was the only thing that mattered about her physical condition at that moment. The federal courthouse was at the north end of Denison's main street, a proper building, stone-faced, 2 stories, with the particular self-importance of a structure that existed to remind the surrounding territory that some authority extended here which could not be bought or bribed or otherwise negotiated with. In theory. A young man was waiting on the steps. He was perhaps 25, thin, with the look of someone who'd been waiting in the rain long enough to stop being annoyed about it, and was now simply wet. Miss Ashcroft? He said. Yes. I'm Fossey. Judge Aldridge is expecting you. He looked at Rhett with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been told about the warrant. Both of you. They followed him inside. Judge Aldridge was not what Eliza had built in her head during 4 days of riding toward him. She'd constructed, somewhere in the back of her mind, a particular type of man, imposing, silver-haired, the visual language of authority. What she got was a compact, round-faced man of about 60, with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and ink on his left hand, and the slightly distracted air of someone who'd been interrupted in the middle of something he'd rather be doing. He was sitting behind a desk that was covered in papers. He didn't stand when they came in, but he did put down the document he'd been reading and look at them with focused attention. Sit down, he said, both of you. He looked at Eliza. Margaret Hale vouched for the seriousness of what you're bringing. I've known Margaret 15 years and she doesn't exaggerate. So, he folded his hands. Show me. Eliza sat. She reached inside her coat and pulled out the oilskin package, and she set it on the desk in front of Aldridge. Then she reached into the saddlebag she'd carried over her shoulder and pulled out her father's journal and set that beside it. The journal is the original, she said. My father, Thomas Ashcroft of Harlan's Creek, kept it over a period of approximately 3 years. The package contains copies I made of the most critical entries, organized by property and by name. She put her hands in her lap. I can walk you through any of it. Aldridge pulled the journal toward him and opened it to the first page. He read for a moment with the focused efficiency of a man who processes written material quickly by profession. Garland Purcell, he said, without looking up. Yes. I'm familiar with the name. Still reading. Not in a legal context. In the context of a man who appears on committees and boards with some regularity and whose name comes up in conversations I've had with 2 other federal colleagues over the past 18 months in connection with land irregularities in adjacent territories. He turned a page. Nothing that rose to the level of actionable evidence. Until now, if what you've brought is what it appears to be. It is, Eliza said. My father was meticulous. The dates, the witnesses, the property descriptions, everything can be cross-referenced with county records. She paused. Some of those county records have probably been altered, but there are enough external reference points, survey records, neighboring property filings, water authority documentation, that the alteration should be detectable. Aldridge looked up at her over the journal. It was a measuring look, but not unkind. You've thought about how to argue this, he said. I've had 4 days on a horse and very little else to think about, she said. Something in his face shifted. The faintest acknowledgement that he found that either accurate or amusing or both. He looked at Rhett. And you, Calloway. You're carrying a warrant from Sheriff Tanner in Harlan's Creek. I am, Rhett said. He said it with no particular defensiveness, just the fact. Tanner's warrant is based on a theft charge connected to the auction system described in these documents, Eliza said, which means the warrant itself is an artifact of the same corrupt network we're presenting evidence against. She kept her voice level. I'd argue that the warrant is retaliatory, issued in bad faith, and connected to a pattern of using legal instruments as harassment tools against people who threaten Purcell's interests. My father documented 3 other instances of that specific pattern. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Rhett. Did you steal her? I outbid 2 drunks at an illegal auction, Rhett said. Whether that's theft depends on whether the auction was legal. I'd say it wasn't. You'd be correct, Aldridge said with the quiet decisiveness of a man who's made the decision already and is simply announcing it. The auction system, as described here, has no legal basis in territorial law. The warrant is void. He made a note on a pad to his left. I'll have papers drawn up by morning. Eliza exhaled slowly. She hadn't fully realized how much of her was still braced for the other outcome until she felt that specific tension release. Purcell will fight this, she said. He has resources. He'll argue the documents are fabricated, that my father's records are the grievance of a man who misunderstood routine land transactions. Let him argue it, Aldridge said. That's what courts are for. He closed the journal carefully. I'll need your formal testimony, both of yours, and I'll be issuing summons to Purcell, to Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft, and to Sheriff Tanner. I'll also be requesting a review of county land records going back 5 years, which will be conducted by a federal examiner, not anyone connected to the county. He looked at her steadily. This will take time. Several months, at minimum. Possibly longer. I know, she said. And in the meantime, Purcell will know we're moving against him. He'll maneuver. He'll maneuver anyway, she said. He's been maneuvering for 3 years. The difference is that now someone with actual jurisdiction knows what he's doing. Aldridge looked at her for a long moment. Your father raised you to think clearly, he said. It hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She kept her face still. He taught me to pay attention, she said. The thinking clearly came from necessity. What happened in the weeks that followed moved with the grinding slowness of formal legal process, which is to say it moved slower than Eliza wanted and faster than Purcell had anticipated. The federal summons reached Purcell at his office in Caldwell on a Thursday morning, delivered by 2 federal marshals who hadn't been told to be subtle about it. The visible nature of the delivery was Aldridge's intention. A public signal that the protective cover Purcell had operated under for years had been removed. Purcell's first move was predictable. He retained 4 lawyers from a firm in the territorial capital and released a public statement describing the proceedings as a politically motivated harassment campaign against a respected community investor. The statement was polished and reasonable sounding and contained not a single true sentence. His second move was to approach 2 of his accomplices, men who had participated directly in specific property seizures documented in Thomas Ashcroft's journal, and make clear that their continued financial relationship depended on their cooperation in the legal proceedings. What he meant was their silence. What he got, because he'd miscalculated the specific weight of personal fear against financial interest when federal jurisdiction was involved, was something different. The first man to cooperate with federal investigators was a property broker named Ash, who had filed several of the forged deeds on Purcell's behalf over the years. Ash had been in the business long enough to understand that a man of Purcell's type, when cornered, identified the most disposable pieces of his operation and offered them. Ash had reason to believe he was a disposable piece. He contacted Aldridge's office on the 8th day after the summons was issued. The second was Vivian's own solicitor, the man who had helped structure the auction arrangements legally, or at least legally adjacent. He came forward not from conscience, but from the discovery, during the federal examination of county records, that Purcell had structured several of the transactions in ways that left the solicitor holding exposure that Purcell himself was insulated from. This was a pattern Purcell had apparently used before. The solicitor's testimony about the auction system's structure was, according to Fossey when he relayed it to Eliza, extremely detailed. Tanner resigned his position as sheriff on the 11th day. He submitted a written resignation to the county board citing personal reasons, which fooled no one, and left Harlan's Creek within 48 hours. He did not cooperate with federal investigators, but his departure removed him from the protective structure that had been keeping Purcell's local operations running, which was nearly as useful. Vivian was a different problem. Eliza had known, in the abstract, that Vivian would not collapse easily. She'd seen the woman's composure at the will reading, the cold precision with which she'd managed every step of her plan, the absence of anything in her that resembled doubt. People like that didn't break when legal pressure arrived. They adapted. They repositioned. What Vivian hadn't fully accounted for was Ash. His testimony about the auction system included specific conversations with Vivian, dates, locations, amounts discussed. It included a letter she'd sent him 14 months ago that contained language about the disposal of estate dependents that was, in Fosse's careful phrasing when he reported it, extremely difficult to interpret charitably. Vivian was arrested on a Wednesday morning in the Ashcroft house, her house, as she'd insisted on calling it, by two federal marshals who'd ridden down from Denison overnight. Eliza heard about it from a woman at the general store in Harlan's Creek, who told her with a barely contained satisfaction that Vivian had walked out to the marshal's horses without visible reaction, gotten into the wagon they'd brought, and not looked back at the house once. Eliza wasn't in Harlan's Creek when it happened. She was at Rhett's Ranch, where she'd been staying while the legal proceedings moved forward, spending the days doing the work that needed doing. There was always work that needed doing on a ranch that had been running short-handed, and the evenings going over Aldridge's correspondence with the focused attention she'd brought to everything since this had started. It was Rhett who told her about Vivian's arrest. He came in from the south pasture in the late afternoon and said it simply, the way he said everything. "Heard from town," he said, hanging his coat. "They took Vivian this morning." Eliza was at the table with a ledger. She set the pen down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. "Good," she said. It was a plain, small word for something that had been 3 years in her father's making and several weeks in her own. But it was the honest word, and she'd learned from her father's journal, from 4 days on a ridge route, from sitting across from a federal judge in wet clothes and making the case with everything she had, that honest words mattered more than impressive ones. "Are you all right?" Rhett said. He was standing by the door with the stillness that was just how he occupied space, watching her. She thought about it genuinely, which was something she hadn't allowed herself to do very often in the last month. "I will be," she said, "when it's finished." She picked up the pen again. "Purcell still has 4 lawyers." "He does," Rhett agreed. "And the territorial court date isn't set yet." "No." "Then I'm not all right yet," she said. "I'm working." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen and started making coffee, which was what he did when he couldn't do anything else useful, and which Eliza had come to recognize as his specific version of solidarity. Outside, the November light was going cold and fast, the way it did at elevation, draining out of the sky in long, pale stages. The valley below the ridge was already in shadow, Harlan's Creek somewhere down there in the dusk, and beyond it the Ashcroft land, her father's land, sitting under the same darkening sky it had always sat under, waiting, as land does, patient in a way that people can't quite manage, for whatever came next. The territorial court date was set for the second week of February, which gave Purcell's 4 lawyers 11 weeks to do what expensive lawyers do when their client is cornered: file motions, request continuances, challenge the admissibility of evidence, and generally make the machinery of justice move as slowly as possible in the hope that something would shift in their favor before it reached a verdict. Nothing shifted. Aldridge denied 3 continuance requests in language that Fosse described to Eliza as unusually direct for a judicial ruling. The evidence examination proceeded on schedule. The federal land examiner, a methodical woman named Clara Briggs, who'd been doing this work for 12 years and had the particular patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed finding discrepancies in documents, produced a report in early January that confirmed and expanded on everything Thomas Ashcroft had documented. 14 properties total, not 11. The 3 additional cases had occurred before Thomas had started his journal, which meant Purcell had been operating this particular scheme for at least 5 years. Eliza read Briggs's report at the kitchen table of her father's house, which she'd moved back into in December, once the legal status of the property had been clarified. It was hers, clearly, documentably, irreversibly hers. The forged will had been invalidated within 2 weeks of Aldridge's examination beginning. There'd been no drama to it, no confrontation, no moment of visible triumph. Just a letter from Fosse containing the relevant legal language, delivered on a cold morning when she was in the middle of mending a fence line on the north pasture. She'd read the letter standing up, in her coat, with mud on her boots. Then she'd folded it and put it in her pocket and gone back to the fence. Some things didn't need a ceremony. The trial itself lasted 4 days. Purcell's lawyers were good, genuinely good, the kind of good that costs serious money and earns it. They challenged the chain of custody on Thomas Ashcroft's journal. They questioned Eliza's credibility as a witness on the basis of personal interest in the outcome. They attempted to characterize Ash's testimony as the self-serving account of a man trying to minimize his own exposure, which was partly true and didn't change what he'd actually said. They were precise and prepared, and they fought for every inch. What they couldn't do was make the document stop saying what they said. Eliza testified on the second day. She sat in the witness chair in a courtroom that was too cold. The stove in the corner had been running all morning and hadn't made a meaningful impression on the temperature, and she answered every question with the same careful accuracy she'd applied to copying her father's records by lamplight on a mountain ranch in November. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't editorialize. She said what she knew, she said how she knew it, and when Purcell's lead attorney tried to rattle her with rapid-fire questions about dates and distances and her own movements during the preceding months, she answered each one steadily and waited for the next. Purcell sat at the defendant's table through all of it. He was a composed man. She'd expected that based on everything she'd heard. In his mid-50s, with the solid, well-maintained look of someone who'd had money long enough that it had become invisible to him, just the air he breathed. He watched the proceedings with the expression of a man attending a business meeting that wasn't going quite the way he'd planned, and who was still confident that his next move would correct that. He looked at Eliza once during her testimony, just once, directly. It was not a threatening look. It was something more unsettling than that, actually. It was the look of a man trying to categorize something he hadn't accounted for, trying to understand where she'd come from and why his machinery hadn't stopped her. She looked back at him and kept talking. Rhett testified on the third day. He sat in the witness chair with his hat on his knee and answered questions in the minimal way that was simply how he communicated, and Purcell's attorney spent 20 minutes trying to expand his answers into something exploitable and got nowhere. When asked to describe the events at Red Bluff Pass, Rhett described them factually, without drama, which turned out to be more effective than drama would have been. The straightforward account of men with rifles waiting in a prepared position at a narrow pass was not something that required embellishment to land heavily in a courtroom. The verdict came on the afternoon of the fourth day. Garland Purcell was found guilty on 7 counts, including fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal land seizure, and what the court described as the systematic exploitation of territorial legal mechanisms for private financial gain. The sentencing would follow within 30 days, but the finding itself was what mattered. The finding was the answer to the question Thomas Ashcroft had been asking alone in his study for 3 years, the question that had cost him his peace and probably, Eliza had come to believe, a significant portion of his health. She sat in the courtroom gallery when the verdict was read and kept her face still and her hands in her lap. She was not going to cry in a public courtroom over a legal finding, regardless of what it meant. She'd made that decision that morning, getting dressed, and she held to it. Beside her, Rhett said nothing, but his hand, resting on his knee, shifted approximately 2 inches until the back of it was against the back of hers. He didn't look at her. She didn't look at him. But the contact was there, and she was grateful for it, and that was enough. Tom. Vivian received a separate sentencing handled in a county proceeding rather than the federal case, which meant the outcome was less certain and took longer to arrive. She was ultimately convicted on charges related to fraud and the auction scheme, the solicitor's testimony having been as detailed and damaging as Fossey had suggested. She received a sentence that her attorney immediately appealed. Eliza didn't attend that proceeding. She had too much work to do. The ranch, when she really looked at it in the clear light of December and January, was in worse shape than she'd let herself acknowledge while everything else was happening. Her father had been sick for almost a year before he died, and the place showed it. Deferred maintenance on the outbuildings, the north fence line in genuinely poor condition, the cattle herd reduced to a number that was functional but not prosperous. The finances, once she'd gone through them properly, were lean in a way that required serious attention. She made a list. She always made lists. Then she started at the top. Margaret Hale had connections to 3 families in the Blanco Crossing area who'd been displaced from their homesteads through Purcell's network, not yet formally restored through the court proceedings, which would take additional time, but displaced. 2 of those families had nowhere immediate to go while the legal process moved forward. Eliza wrote to Margaret in January with a specific proposition: temporary work and housing on the Ashcroft Ranch, in exchange for labor, with the understanding that when their own land was restored to them, they were free to go. She didn't think of it as charity. She needed the hands, and they needed somewhere to be. The math was simple. The first family arrived in February, a week after Purcell's verdict. The Reyes family, a man named Domingo, his wife Cara, and their teenage son, who turned out to have a natural aptitude with horses that immediately improved the efficiency of the whole operation. The second family came in March. By April, there were 7 additional people working the Ashcroft land, including a widow named June Pratt, who'd come down from the northern county after her husband's death and had experience with cattle operations that exceeded Eliza's own. June was 52 and opinionated and had strong views about fence construction that she expressed regularly and at length, and she was exactly what the ranch needed. "You're building something here," June told Eliza one evening in April, sitting on the porch steps with coffee after a long day. The evening light was doing the thing it did in spring, going golden and slow, the kind of light that made even tired people look well. "I'm running a ranch," Eliza said. "You're running it like a person who's building something," June said. "There's a difference. Most people running a ranch are just trying to keep from losing it. You're deciding what it should become." Eliza turned her coffee cup in her hands. She hadn't thought about it in exactly those terms, but she recognized the description as accurate. "My father wanted this land to mean something," she said. "Not just to us, to the people around us." She looked out at the yard where Domingo's son was working with a young horse in the corral, patient and methodical in the failing light. "I think he didn't know how to make that happen. He saw what was wrong with everything around him, and he wrote it all down, and he didn't know what to do with it." She paused. "I'm trying to figure out the part that comes after writing it down." June was quiet for a moment. "You know what he would have thought of all this?" "I think he would have worried about the finances," Eliza said. June laughed, a real laugh, not polite. "Probably right." Rhett came down from the mountain ranch in March and stayed for a week to help with the spring cattle work, and then came down again in April for the same reason. And somewhere in that second visit, the fiction that he was coming down for the cattle work stopped being something either of them bothered to maintain. He brought 2 of his own horses the second time, and when Eliza pointed out that this was a significant amount of trouble to go to for a week's visit, he said that he'd been thinking about whether the mountain ranch was a practical long-term operation for a single person. And she said that a single person didn't have to run it alone. And they looked at each other across the barn with the careful attention of 2 people who'd survived enough together to know what they actually meant. He moved the mountain operation down in May. Not all of it at once. The high ranch remained a grazing property, useful for summer pasture, and he kept it. But the main work shifted to the Ashcroft land, and the main work of the Ashcroft land expanded accordingly. It was not a smooth process. 2 people who are both accustomed to making decisions independently and doing things their own way do not merge operations without friction, and Eliza and Rhett had more than the usual amount of friction to work through because neither of them was the type to smooth things over with pleasant agreement when they actually disagreed. They had arguments about cattle management and fence placement and the allocation of resources between the immediate needs of the current season and the longer-term investments that Eliza's building instinct kept pushing her toward. One argument in particular about whether to put money into a new barn or into expanding the cattle herd went on for 3 days and involved them not speaking directly to each other for approximately 18 hours at the midpoint, which was uncomfortable for everyone else on the ranch, and which resolved when Rhett, on the evening of the 3rd day, said flatly that she was right about the barn, and he'd been wrong about the timing, and she said that she understood his reasoning about the herd and that they could do both if they sequenced it correctly, and they worked out a plan that neither of them had thought of individually. After that, the arguments were still there, but they moved faster toward resolution, which was, Eliza thought, probably the best you could say about any partnership between 2 difficult people. The 14 families affected by Purcell's network received formal restitution rulings over the course of the spring and summer, a slow, irregular process that happened in stages, each case requiring its own proceeding, its own documentation, its own specific legal resolution. Some families got their land back outright. Some received financial settlements because the land itself had been further transferred in ways that made direct return complicated. 2 cases were still pending when the summer ended. Eliza followed each one. She kept a list, of course she kept a list, with the family names and the case status and the outcome as it came in. She updated it every time Fossey sent word. The last name on the list was the widow Crane, whose property had disappeared into Purcell's network before Thomas had started his journal, which made the documentation thinner. Her case was the most complicated, but Aldridge was methodical, and Briggs had found enough in the property records to establish a pattern, and in September the ruling came through in Crane's favor. A small parcel, not the full original property, but documented land returned to its rightful owner after 4 years of displacement. Eliza wrote the date next to the widow Crane's name and closed the ledger. She was sitting at the kitchen table when she did it, the same table where she'd sat with her father's journal on the first night in Rhett's mountain ranch, working through the terrible arithmetic of what Thomas had discovered. The kitchen was different now. There were coffee cups belonging to other people on the shelf. There was noise from the yard outside, the ordinary sounds of a working property with more than 2 people on it. The window she'd looked through at the dark yard on the morning Vivian's men had come was the same window, but the yard it looked out on was not the same yard. It was busier, messier, more alive. Rhett came in from outside and looked at her closed ledger and then at her face, which apparently told him something because he didn't ask what she was doing. He sat down across from her. "Last one?" he said. "Widow Crane," she said. "It came through this morning." He nodded. A quiet nod, the kind that carries weight without trying to. "Your father would have wanted to know that one specifically," he said. "The Crane property was the first one he documented." "I know." She ran her thumb across the ledger cover. He never got to know if any of it would matter. He just kept writing it down because he thought it should be written, because he thought someone should know. She looked at the table for a moment. "I used to think that was helpless, just watching something wrong happen and writing about it instead of stopping it." "And now?" Rhett said. She thought about it honestly, about the journal with its 3 years of careful entries, about the way those pages had become, in Aldridge's courtroom, the spine of something that 14 families had their land back because of. "Now I think it takes a particular kind of stubbornness," she said, "to keep paying attention to a thing when you can't see how it helps. To trust that truth written down doesn't disappear, even if you do." She paused. "He was more stubborn than I gave him credit for." Rhett looked at her with those dark eyes that she'd spent a year learning to read. "He raised you," he said. "That tracks." She picked up the ledger and set it on the shelf beside the other ledgers, the cattle records, the financial accounts, the work rosters for the ranch. It sat there, a plain book with nothing on the cover, containing the end of a list that had started with her father's fear and finished with her own persistence and a federal judge who hadn't been viable. Not a perfect ending. There were families who'd gotten less than what was taken from them. There were cases that had settled for financial compensation because the land itself was gone in ways too complicated to reverse. There was the woman from the auction with the bitten nails, whose name Eliza had never learned and whom she thought about more often than she'd have admitted. Some wrongs don't finish. Some wrongs leave behind shapes that persist in the landscape of things, changed but not removed. But the system that had produced them, the interlocking machinery of Purcell's fraud, the bought sheriff, the fraudulent auction, the forged documents and the manufactured debts, and the slow harassment of people who had nothing to fight back with, that was finished. Not by a single heroic act, but by a journal and a ride through rough country and a telegraph to Margaret Hale and a woman sitting in a cold courtroom saying what she knew, plainly, without embellishment, until the truth of it filled the room. The autumn came in the same way it had the year before. Early and cold, the smell of dry grass on the wind off the ridge. Eliza stood on the porch one evening in October and looked out at the valley she'd grown up in and thought about how different the same view could look depending on where you were standing when you looked at it. Behind her, through the kitchen window, she could hear the sounds of the household. June's voice, Domingo's son laughing at something, The clatter of the evening meal being put together by several people working in the comfortable chaos of a shared space. Rhett was somewhere in the barn, which was the new barn, finished in August, and which he had been grudgingly satisfied with ever since completion in the way of a person who's been proven wrong and has made a private peace with it. She thought about her father, about the way he'd stood on the same porch, probably in the same autumn light, writing things down in his head before he wrote them on paper, watching a wrong accumulate in the world around him, and trying to decide what to do with what he saw. She thought about the girl she'd been standing at his grave, making promises about not crying in front of Vivian. That girl had been right about what she felt, but narrow about what she could do. She'd grown into something larger than that, not cleaner. She wasn't cleaner. She had a year of hard riding and harder decisions in her that would never wash out entirely, but larger, more capable of holding more than one thing at once. The valley below was going dark in the long October way, the shadow of the ridge moving east across the grass. She was 24 years old. She owned her father's land. She had 11 people depending on the decision she made about it, and 2 pending applications from families still waiting for their own restitution cases to close, and a working partnership with a difficult man she trusted more than anyone she'd ever known, which was saying something, because she did not trust easily. She was not finished. There was too much left to do, too many threads still loose, too much that the past year had opened up that she hadn't had time to fully address. The other women from the auction, she'd tracked down 3 of them through a combination of correspondence and asking the right questions of the right people. And she'd been thinking about what it would mean to build something more formal around the kind of help the ranch had already started offering to displaced families. Something with a structure, something that could persist beyond one person's attention. That was a future problem. Tonight was a present one, which meant dinner and the barn check and the endless specific arithmetic of running a place with people in it. She turned to go back inside. The porch door opened before she reached it, and Rhett came out with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of a man who'd correctly guessed where she was and what she was probably doing out here alone. He handed her one of the cups. "Thinking?" he said. "Always," she said. He stood beside her and looked out at the valley for a moment, at the dark shapes of the cattle moving in the south pasture, at the distant lights of Harlan's Creek in the valley below. Small and ordinary. The lights of a town that had watched something terrible happen in its square one autumn morning and gone home and said nothing, and which was now, slowly, learning to be something different under the pressure of changed circumstances. Towns don't reform from conscience, mostly. They reform because the structures that made certain things possible get dismantled, and what grows in their place depends on who's doing the building. "She's going to be all right," June had said about the ranch a few weeks back, talking to Domingo's wife in the kitchen, not knowing Eliza could hear from the hall. "Girl knows what she's doing." Eliza had stood in the hall for a moment with that sentence sitting in her chest like something warm and slightly unfamiliar. Then she'd gone about her work. She knew what she was doing, not all of it, not the parts that were still forming, the ideas that didn't have full shapes yet, but the core of it, the direction of it. She was building what her father had seen the shape of and hadn't known how to make real. A place where people who'd lost things could land and work and find their footing. Not a rescue. She was careful about that word, careful about the whole frame of it, because people who've lost things don't need rescuing. They need ground under their feet and room to be capable. But a place with enough room in it for other people's futures to take root alongside her own. It wouldn't always work. She'd already had one situation where the help she offered hadn't been the help someone needed, and she'd had to sit with the fact that she didn't always get it right. She probably wouldn't always get it right in the future either. That was the honest version of it. But she was going to keep trying, and she was going to keep paying attention, and she was going to write things down when she saw things that needed to be written. Her father had taught her that. Not by telling her. By doing it alone in a cold study for 3 years, with shaking hands, trusting that the truth of what he'd seen was worth preserving, even when he couldn't see what it would become. She'd shown him what it could become. The coffee was hot in her hands. The valley was dark and quiet below. Beside her, Rhett said nothing, which was how he said most things, and which she'd stopped needing to translate a long time ago. She looked out at the land. It had been her father's. Now it was hers. Someday it would belong to whatever came after her. The people she was building with, the work that would continue past her own specific ability to continue it. The idea of a place that held more than one person's worth of story. Not a monument, not a legend, just a working ranch with too much to do and not enough hours in the day, and a table that seated more people than it used to, in a valley that was slowly, imperfectly, one court ruling and one restored deed at a time, becoming something closer to honest. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly what Thomas Ashcroft had been trying to write his way toward, alone in the dark, and what his daughter had ridden through cold and danger and an ambush in the rocks to bring into the light. The wind came down off the ridge, the same wind it had always been, moving through the same grass, carrying the same smell of autumn and coming cold. Eliza Ashcroft stood on her porch and held her coffee and looked at her land. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt no need to brace for what came next.